Good morning. I'm Ben Haddad. I'm the director of the Future Europe Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Thanks for joining me for a live conversation with Enrico Letta, former Prime Minister of Italy, Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, and president of the think tank, the Jacques Delors Institute, specialized in the European Union. Prime Minister Letta, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's an honor. We'll be talking about how the European Union and Italy are coping with COVID-19, both on the health side, but also, of course, as we're in the midst of a Eurogroup summit right now, we'll be talking about the economic response and the longer-term geopolitical consequences for the European Union of this unprecedented crisis. As you know, the Future Europe Initiative here at the Atlantic Council is devoted to explaining the European Union to American policymakers, to making the case that it is a critical strategic partner of the United States. In this troubled time for the transatlantic relationship, we're really glad to be able to host you and have this conversation with you. We talked 2 days ago to EU Commissioner Ylva Johansson also about how the EU Commission has been responding to this crisis, and will continue in the next days and weeks to have this conversation with senior European policymakers to explain and to make the case for a strong partnership with the EU and its member states. Mr. Letta, first, you're in Rome right now. Let me ask you, how are Italians doing? How is Italy coping? The country has been very hard struck by COVID-19, of course, but we're seeing now the curve starting to flatten. Where do you think is Italy in its war against the virus?
First of all, thank you for this opportunity. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and to the European Initiative of the Atlantic Council. I think that in this crisis, transatlantic ties are very important, and we have to strengthen it. In Rome, of course, we used to live the most tragic months in the entire life, entire generations. Because of the lack of hope, because of the number of deaths and the tragic situation sequence and the unexpected situation, without having any track, and without having any written pages of instructions. So we were obliged to be in terra incognita, as we say in Latin. So I think these uncharted territories were a sort of challenge for the country. In these very days, in these very hours, there's some hope that the peak is behind us, and some hope that maybe in the next weeks we can start again thinking of the future. Until now, the only worry is about death and about the tragedy that occurred.
Yeah, so as you said, some hope that the peak is behind us. And obviously, Italy was only a harbinger of things to come for other European countries. Now we've seen the virus strike every European country, and obviously the United States as well, as this global crisis unfolds. I want to ask you, you know the European Union very well. You're Prime Minister, you were a Minister for European Affairs, a member of the European Parliament. How do you think the EU has been coping? We've seen divisions and criticism initially, but now we are seeing some measures of solidarity, exchange of information, of medical equipment between member states. What's your assessment of how the EU has been responding to this crisis?
We have to say that it was an unprecedented challenge for the European Union. The European Union, I try always to underline the fact that has no competence on sanitary issues, because the member states decided to keep these issues in their own competences. And now we understood how we say, not very intelligent was this decision, because at the end of the day, the need to cooperate at the European level is absolutely necessary, even at sanitary level. So I think my answer is an answer saying that the European institutions did a good job, a very good job. When I say the European institutions, I say the typical communitarian institutions, the federal institutions. I mean the European Commission and the European Central Bank. Even the European Parliament, I think, did a great job, because the European Parliament decided to keep open and to stay open, and I think and to vote remotely. It was a great example on how democracy can work, even in this terrible situation. And it is a big challenge also for those like Hungary, for instance. They decided to close the parliament, and the European Parliament decided to be open. The ECB and the European Commission did a great job, and today the situation is not like 10 years ago with spreads or with high interest rates and financial instability because of the good job made by the ECB and the European Commission. I used to say that in 4 weeks, the federal institutions did what the federal institutions did in 4 years in the previous crisis. We needed 4 years from 2008 until 2012 to the famous whatever it takes of Mario Draghi. Now from 4 years to 4 weeks. So that's a good news. What is missing until now is the response of the member states. And that is a problem. This is why I say that the glass is half full, maybe. But to be completely full, we need the response of the member states. And that means the other institutions. So the European Council, composed by the member states. And until now, the divisions are there. And I think we are, our meeting is very timely because we are waiting this afternoon in Brussels, the conclusions of the Eurogroup and then the European Council. And we need to have an agreement among member states, because if we don't, the message of the division of the European Union will be stronger than what the European institutions did in a very wise way. So I think it is absolutely necessary, and I hope this agreement will come.
Yeah, thank you. I do think you're making a really important distinction that is often lost in the conversation between how the European institutions have responded and how member states are responding. And we have seen a lot of very quick reactions from the European Commission suspending, for example, the budgetary rule of Maastricht to be able to give leeway to member states to spend to respond to the crisis. We've seen the suspension of some regulations on medication to be able to get a quicker flow of equipment among Europeans. And obviously, as you said, Christine Lagarde, the ECB reacting quickly and basically following the steps of your countryman Mario Draghi, who had said he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, which really turned things around during the Eurozone crisis. But now, as you mentioned, we're in the midst of a pretty intense debate between member states over the longer term economic response. And it's sort of repeating arguments that we had heard during the Eurozone crisis over whether the Eurozone is complete or not. We've seen this debate over the creation of Eurobonds, which would be instruments that would allow Europeans to pool their resources to be able to lend together. Yesterday, the Eurogroup, which is the gathering of finance ministers of the Eurozone, did not come to an agreement. We see divisions to make it, I would say, a little schematic between the North and the South. What do you expect from the Eurogroup? Can you explain a little bit to us what these debates are, what Eurobonds are? We're talking about Coronabonds now, and why do you think if they are necessary or not? And before you answer, let me just say, we already have some questions. For those of us who are watching, you can write down your question in the Q&A box, and we will pick them up at the end of the conversation. And you can also, if you're watching on Twitter and on Periscope, you can just directly answer to me or to the Atlantic Council Twitter account and ask your question, and we will look at them as well.
I start by saying that we take a very important lesson from this. That is, governance matters. Because, for instance, when you have European institutions able to work without any unanimity rule, but with the capability and the availability to work and to act, they are, in an emergency situation, very effective. The European Council, in discussions like the one they are having, needs a sort of unanimity, even if it is not required by rules, but at the end of the day, they try to have unanimity. And if you need unanimity, at the end of the day, it is less effective. And this is what is happening in this very day. So governance is important. And second, what is the beef? I think the key question is the fact that this crisis is unprecedented. So we don't have any toolbox ready because it is unprecedented. And toolbox needs, there's a sanitary part of the crisis and there's an economic emergency part of the crisis. The recession will be, I think, deeper than 10 years ago. Unemployment will raise, lack of growth will raise, and not only in Italy and Spain. I have to say that it's very short view, the idea that it's a crisis in Europe for Italy and Spain. It is a crisis for the entire European Union because our economy is very integrated. The virus attacked Italy and Spain not because of the debt, but because of it was like that. But the virus is in New York City, is in London, is everywhere. So it is a very strange situation today. So the need to have an economic response able to relaunch real economy is absolutely necessary. Another lesson from previous crisis. Previous crisis was first a financial crisis, then it became a real economic crisis, then it became a social crisis, and then it became a political crisis. 4 different ways. Now, the key point is that this crisis, until now, risks to be altogether financial, economic, social, and political crisis. Political also because the ways of anti-Europeanism in southern countries risks to be immediate. So it is important to have all the different tools working and new tools. You mentioned Coronabonds. I think the possibility of a compromise is there. The 2 positions are northern countries. They say we want to help, but we don't want to help by mutualizing the debt. And I think it's absolutely comprehensible. I accept this position because debts are from the past. Now we have to work on the future and we have to work with tools working without discussing the past. It's not the moment. Position from the South, we need a European initiative. It is not enough to have just national initiatives allowed by the suspension of the Stability Pact. So we need to find an agreement, a composition between these 2 positions. I think it is possible. There's this idea of a recovery fund. This recovery fund can make emissions and can have a bond. This bond is without any mutualization of debt. And this activity can be for the future, having money all together to spend all together for the economic relaunch. And we can have all guarantees that this money is checked among us by European institutions and with European guarantees. So there's no way, I think, to continue with these propaganda flags. Northern countries say that it's always the same problem. You, the Southerns, you are grasshoppers, and the Southern countries saying that you are arrogant, you don't want to help us. So I think we need it. If we don't find it, I think it is a great responsibility because the entire world will focus this disagreement and not all the very important achievement that the federal institutions did. But at the end of the day, for the information I have now, the big responsibility is in the hands of one country, because there's one country blocking the agreement in this country. And I'm not happy because it's one of the funders of the European Union, is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands are taking this very strange position, very antagonistic position. And even with all these assurances from the southern countries, the idea to block everything and to say just, we can give you some money, but just for sanitary needs. They don't understand that the problem today is a sanitary problem, but for the next 12 months, it will be an economic disaster. And this economic disaster will be for everyone. So I think we need an agreement. I know that France and Germany are trying to find a compromise. There's a large part of countries pushing for the agreement. Italy is among them. I hope this position of the Netherlands will be stopped.
Yeah, and you mentioned the differences with the previous crisis, and obviously one difference is the scope of this economic crisis, but also the fact, as 9 heads of states have mentioned in a letter initially asking for Eurobond, the external and asymmetric nature of the shock. And as you said, it's not only Italy or Spain, but it's every country that is going to be impacted in a way or another by both the health, the sanitary, and the economic crisis. I think there's another major difference that's also sometimes a little lost in the conversation, is the fact that the world is very different now in 2020 from what it was in 2008. We have a transatlantic relationship that is troubled, with U.S. that has responded to this crisis in a very inward-looking way. We have China that is becoming much more assertive, and even though the crisis started there with some questions about how Chinese authorities have initially lied about the crisis in their response, we've seen China sort of step up its a propaganda effort in Europe to respond to this crisis. We have a lot of questions, and a few of them are precisely on this. On how do you think what do you think this means in the longer run for the relationship between Italy and more generally the EU and China, and as well for the transatlantic relations? Questions from Satoshi and from Nick in Paris.
I think it's a crucial point. My feeling is that it's the first crisis in a post-American world, if I may say, because at the end of the day, it's the first crisis where you don't find any American leadership. America was marginal at the very beginning of the crisis. Now is the epicenter, but it seems that the American leadership is not there to lead the world as it was always. And as a very pro-Atlantic, very pro-transatlantic, one of my first young activities was a study trip in the US for 1 month with the Atlantic Council in '88. I was very young at that time. So I'm very much linked to this idea. And I think that maybe one of the most important lessons from this crisis is that we have to reconsider the priority and the importance of the relationship between EU 27, UK, US. We have to put all these people in one room after the end of this crisis and to say, hey, people, now stop joking. We have to work together because the world needs this kind of agreement among these countries. You mentioned the relationship between China and Italy and Europe. It is clear that China had a lot of opportunities to take room and to take space, and they did it, and they were very good at propaganda because they were there with their planes with sanitary masks exactly the same day in which 1 million of sanitary masks, Italian sanitary masks, were blocked at the border in Germany because of some strange customs. So it is clear that the reaction in terms of the public opinion was very strong against Germany and very in favor of this Chinese approach. So I think we have to really focus the post-crisis world, and we have to rebuild up this transatlantic relationship. It is necessary. It is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do think rebuilding the transatlantic relationship will be absolutely key, and especially as we think about the economic response and the geopolitical consequences of this economic response. It won't be only rebuilding our own European and U.S. economy. It will be also our neighbors, our partners in Africa and Central Asia and the Western Balkans and elsewhere, where obviously China is going to step up with financing, and will need the Europeans and the United States to to be there also to promote their own values and systems. We have a lot of different questions. Some of them you've already answered. There's a few questions on the next step when it comes to Eurobonds and the economic debate. If Europeans cannot come to an agreement on this, we've heard some rumors of some countries going alone, maybe France, Italy, and Spain building Eurobonds together. How realistic is this option according to you?
I think it is realistic in terms of pressure to the Germans, because at the end of the day, it is important to have the Germans on board. It is not very easy to build up, but I'm sure that the compromise will be there. It is necessary to have a compromise, and this compromise is absolutely possible, because at the end of the day, the euro area economy is today really integrated. More than what we think in terms of image. You think Mercedes, you think a German car. Mercedes, 1/3 of Mercedes is made in Italy. So it's an integrated market, and we are all together. This is why it is impossible to see divisions. It is absolutely crucial to work together and to find these agreements. And at the end of the day, I don't think it is today's meeting that will give the answer, because the problem is more political. So it's in the hands of the leaders, and the leaders, they have to take their own responsibilities. So in the European Council. But I have also to remind all our friends that 10 years ago, it took 40 meetings of the European Council before getting the big change and the big solutions to the crisis. So it is a complicated path. This time, I think it is possible to have it in a very short term, but I am not there saying that if it is needed 1, 2, 3 meetings, it is not a problem. What is necessary is to do it in a proper way and to find the good solutions, and to consider that, if I may say, this crisis will bring a revolution in the job market. Exactly because of what we are doing now. We are having a seminar on digital. We were supposed to have this seminar live. I was supposed to be in Washington, D.C. 1 month ago. Now we are here, we are working. Our courses at university, they are all working online today. There's an acceleration in digitalization and automation. At the end of this crisis, we will, unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, understand that the job market will be in a revolution. And that will bring a social disease for many people, and very workers completely displaced in their activity. So we need to consider that it is not just a challenge in terms of immediate response, in terms of cash money, but in terms of reorganization of the society. And to do so, we need to have cooperation among countries. I don't think this crisis is the end of globalization. I don't think this crisis is the rise of new nationalism, stop to global cooperation. It is exactly the opposite. This crisis is the end of borders. This crisis is the demonstration that we are all depending on each other. We need to work and to cooperate all together. So it is, I think, a big boost for global cooperation, not the contrary.
Yeah, and clearly this is the message that we will hear from the European Union, that is built on this idea of multilateralism and global cooperation to rebuild the world after the crisis, investing in international organizations and cooperation. You mentioned digital. I think it's very interesting because we have seen this as a key priority of the European Union in the last few years. We've heard the term digital sovereignty as one of the objectives of this new commission. GDPR, the protection of privacy and data, was one of the successes of the previous commission. So do you think what we're going through right now, and as a lot of us have moved to teleworking and doing these meetings online, or just checking on our family through Zoom and other instruments like this. Do you think this is only going to increase this call and this focus on digital sovereignty for the Commission?
Yeah, but take this example, the example just you made. We were discussing some months ago about technological humanism, about sovereign technology, about all this, about data protection, data ownership, privacy. And now immediately this acceleration is bringing us in a new world, because these discussions are not theoretical discussions. We are all tracked in terms of are we really locked down seriously or not? And through our iPhones or through our devices, it is possible to do it. Is it possible to do it now because we are in an emergency? Yes. Do we want to continue this kind of track or this kind of global big brother? It is not a theoretical discussion. It is reality. It is our lives. This is why I think the European Union today is more important than yesterday, because at the end of the day, the European Union, with this idea of technological humanism and the person at the very center of this discussion, can bring something positive to the world, a world in which for someone is more market-oriented, for someone else is more state-oriented. I think we have to put the people at the very center of this discussion. The respect of human digital rights are so important. Now we immediately and suddenly understand that it is our lives. It's not life of next generations. And the European Union, it was a good point. You know, the European Union in this commission, these 5 years that started last year, two big items, two big subjects. One, technology. Second one, of course, climate change and the Green New Deal. I think these subjects are the subject of the future, and they need cooperation. And I think the European Union is there exactly to cooperate and to try to boost multilateralism.
Absolutely. A few people are asking a question that you brought upon a little earlier, is the question of the risk of a populist backlash. I mean, we talked about this crisis being different from 2008 for various reasons. Obviously, one of them is the populist backlash that we have seen in the last few years in our democracies, in the United States and in Europe, as partly a consequence of the 2008 crisis. And obviously, one first country deciding to leave the European Union with the UK, and the rise of far right and far left movements in Italy and elsewhere. What do you think is the risk of a populist rise after this? Because the counter argument saying that, you know, what we're seeing on the contrary calls for expertise, calls for reasonable leadership, and the kind of cooperation that you're talking about.
It is not easy to say, because we are at the beginning of a long period, because this crisis will last. But I take some lessons. One lesson is that competence is back. And I think it's not a bad news, because we are considering that it is important to have scientific-based decisions, to have competent people, and that is maybe a new way to think again on how to select leaderships and so on. There's a second, I think, very important point, that is the fact that in Europe, there are two countries that are today in the very focus on the very heart of the problem of Europe, anti-Europeanism. These two countries are Italy and Spain, because also of the crisis. But in these two countries, and Italy more than Spain, there's the idea that at the end of the day, we are left alone. And that is also because this crisis is not the first crisis. We have to consider that the sequence of the financial crisis in 2008-12 and the migration crisis, the welcome refugee crisis of 14-15, they left a lot of problems. And in Italy, the main problem was the feeling that other countries, not the countries, left us alone. And this is why part of Italian voters are today saying that is the third time that we are left alone. And we can't consider that Europe is our home. Of course, I repeat, and we all repeat, that what the European Central Bank is doing, what the European Commission is doing, is enormous in terms of support and umbrella, and that is keeping Italy alive. But there's a sentiment, a feeling that is today very important, and this attitude of the Dutch leaders, for instance, or some German newspapers, in this very moment, were very, very negative. So I am afraid that the rise of anti-Europeanism is something that will last for this year, and that will create some problem. And the third point is about Hungary. I mentioned Hungary. The idea that part of Europe, and Hungary is the very core of that, is thinking that rule of law and European values, democratic values, are less important than effectiveness. And that's a problem. I think this crisis is also a challenge. The challenge to say we, the Europeans, we, Western democracies, we are able to tackle the crisis within the rule of law. And that is a very important challenge.
It is a very important challenge. And you mentioned it both for the rule of law at home and for rebuilding global cooperation between our democracies. And you made, I think, a very eloquent case for the transatlantic relationship, for a stronger partnership between the US, the EU, and the UK. And as you know, this is really the mission statement of the Atlantic Council. And this is why we're here having this conversation. I was so glad to be able to have this conversation with you because as you mentioned, we were supposed to host you last month at the Atlantic Council. I think, in fact, this was the first event that we had to cancel both because of the coronavirus. And so it's so great to be able to talk to you virtually, but we'll look forward to hosting you in Washington when we'll be able to travel again. Prime Minister Letta, thank you so much for your commentary and your expertise. Stay safe and well in Rome, and I do hope to host you soon. And thanks for all of you for joining this conversation and for asking your questions.
Thank you.